Canada is experiencing a significant political moment as Prime Minister Mark Carney has signed a controversial energy deal with Alberta that could reshape the country's oil export strategy. This agreement has already triggered a cabinet resignation and sparked fierce debate across provincial lines. Let's start with what actually happened. Prime Minister Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith signed an energy accord that opens the door for a new oil pipeline running from Alberta to the Pacific coast. This isn't just any infrastructure project. It represents a fundamental shift in how Canada approaches both energy development and climate policy. First, Alberta gets exemptions from certain federal climate laws for this proposed pipeline. The agreement also suspends the federal oil and gas emissions cap that was previously in place under Justin Trudeau's government. Perhaps most significantly, it exempts the pipeline from a tanker ban off British Columbia's coast, a major reversal of previous policy. But Alberta doesn't get these concessions for free. In exchange, the province must significantly increase its carbon pricing and commit to developing what would be the world's largest carbon capture program. The goal is to reduce Alberta's overall emissions, even while expanding its oil infrastructure. The deal also includes some important conditions. The pipeline must have Indigenous co-ownership. It must be financed by private companies rather than taxpayer dollars. And British Columbia must be brought into discussions immediately. Alberta has committed 14 million Canadian dollars to develop a proposal, hoping that private sector investors will eventually take over the project. The pipeline is still in preliminary stages, with no firm route identified, though it's expected to run through to BC's northern coast. To understand why this deal is so significant, we need to look at Canada's current oil export situation. Right now, the United States purchases over 90% of Canadian crude oil exports. Canada is essentially putting all its economic eggs in one basket. Prime Minister Carney has explicitly stated that this dependence on the U.S. market has become a vulnerability, especially given the protectionist tariffs implemented by President Donald Trump. His administration aims to double non-U.S. exports over the next decade, and this pipeline to the Pacific would open up access to Asian markets, potentially China, Japan, South Korea, and other major oil consumers. For Alberta, this represents something even more profound. Premier Danielle Smith called the deal the end of what she termed the province's dark times. Alberta has long felt constrained by federal environmental policies that, in the province's view, prevented it from fully developing its oil resources. This agreement represents a historic reset between Alberta and the federal government in Ottawa.
From an economic perspective, diversifying Canada's oil export markets could strengthen the country's negotiating position and reduce vulnerability to U.S. policy changes. But it also comes with significant environmental and political costs that we're already seeing play out. This deal faces opposition from multiple directions, and some of these challenges could prove insurmountable. First, let's start with British Columbia. Premier David Eby has been sharply critical, calling the pipeline a distraction. His frustration is palpable. BC wasn't included in the discussions leading up to the agreement, despite the fact that the pipeline would run through his province. As he pointedly noted, it would have been good for BC to be at the table. Eby's concerns go beyond just being excluded from negotiations. He's worried that an oil pipeline through BC could undermine support from Indigenous communities for liquefied natural gas projects that his province is pursuing. He described the pipeline as potentially becoming an energy vampire that could drain resources and political capital from other energy initiatives. Then there's the Indigenous opposition. A group representing coastal First Nations in BC issued a statement declaring that an oil pipeline to the province's northern coast will never happen. This is crucial because the deal itself requires Indigenous co-ownership, meaning the project literally cannot proceed without Indigenous support. The environmental opposition became dramatic and immediate. Stephen Gawa, who served as culture minister and previously as environment minister, resigned from Carney's cabinet just hours after the deal was announced. Gawa is no casual environmentalist. He worked for Greenpeace before entering politics and famously scaled Toronto's CN Tower in 2001 as part of a climate protest. In his resignation statement, Gawa said he strongly opposed the energy agreement and believed the proposed pipeline would have major environmental impacts. He expressed concern that many elements of the climate action plan that he'd implemented as environment minister have been or are about to be dismantled. Even political opponents see problems. Conservative leader Poilievre criticized the deal as merely kickstarting a lengthy process that doesn't guarantee the pipeline's completion. He took a shot at Carney's campaign promise to move with unimaginable speed, suggesting that this agreement goes far short of that pledge. This pipeline debate touches on some of the most contentious issues in Canadian politics: the balance between economic development and environmental protection, federal versus provincial powers, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and Canada's place in global energy markets. Canada finds itself in a complex position. On one hand, it's committed to meeting climate targets and transitioning away from fossil fuels. On the other hand, oil and gas remain crucial to the Canadian economy, particularly in Alberta. The question is whether you can expand oil infrastructure while still reducing emissions through measures like carbon capture and increased carbon pricing.
The deal Carney and Smith signed essentially bets that technology and carbon pricing can offset the emissions from increased oil production and transport. Critics argue this is contradictory and that real climate action requires reducing fossil fuel extraction, not expanding it with conditions attached. There's also the question of Indigenous rights and consultation. Modern Canadian resource development requires meaningful Indigenous consent, not just consultation. The fact that coastal First Nations have already rejected the project and that the deal requires Indigenous co-ownership suggests this pipeline faces an uphill battle regardless of what provincial and federal governments want. So, where does this go from here? The agreement commits Ottawa and Alberta to immediately bring British Columbia into discussions. But Premier Eby has already made his skepticism clear. These will not be easy negotiations. The project still needs private sector backing. While Alberta has committed initial funding for a proposal, the actual construction would need to be financed by private companies. Given the political opposition, Indigenous resistance, and environmental concerns, attracting that private investment may prove challenging. Indigenous consultation and co-ownership negotiations will be critical. Without Indigenous support, this pipeline simply cannot proceed under the terms of the deal. Building that support, given the opposition already expressed by coastal First Nations, will require substantial effort and compromise. There's also the question of whether Guaibault's resignation represents the beginning of broader political fallout for Carney. Will other environmentally minded members of his government follow suit? How will this affect his political standing? The permitting and regulatory process will take years, even in a best-case scenario. Environmental assessments, route planning, and regulatory approvals are complex and time-consuming, particularly for a project of this scale running through environmentally sensitive areas. What we're witnessing is a fundamental tension in Canadian politics and policy. Prime Minister Carney is attempting to thread a very difficult needle, expanding oil infrastructure to reduce economic dependence on the United States while claiming to maintain climate ambitions through carbon pricing and capture technology. Whether this approach can satisfy economic, environmental, and Indigenous concerns remains highly uncertain. The immediate resignation of a senior cabinet minister and the strong opposition from British Columbia and Indigenous groups suggests the road ahead will be anything but smooth. This pipeline deal may represent a reset between Alberta or Ottawa, but it has simultaneously opened new rifts that could reshape Canadian politics in the months and years to come. The question now is whether this agreement represents a workable compromise or an unstable political arrangement destined to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Thank you for watching. We'll continue to follow his story as it develops.